Welcome to 28 Days and Beyond,
where we talk about our history, our heritage, and our culture.
I'm Amari.
I'm Charisma. Welcome back.
Charisma, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right.
All right? Just all right?
Doing very well, actually.
Okay, I like very well. That's better.
That's it. Let me ask you a question.
No.
Okay. So they say we live in an increasingly shrinking world, right? Do you think that it is acceptable to sort of limit your vision to the United States in terms of being a global player, so on and so forth?
Absolutely not.
I mean, but everybody speaks English, though.
Was there like another cell?
No, you know,
that's it.
Hey.
That's the only cell?
So obviously, right, for the past, whatever, decades, at this point, centuries, maybe, the sort of world sort of revolved around the United States. But in an increasingly global market, an increasingly global world, we're seeing, cultural centers erupting elsewhere.
Yeah.
Sometimes, so there was a comment made recently by, what's his name, Daniel such and such from, he was in Black Panther, he was also in Get Out.
I know who you're talking about, the lead character.
Exactly.
I always mispronounce his last name.
So he made a comment in a press conference. He's like, well, Americans sometimes are not really aware of other things that are happening in the world. In other words, they think that things are only happening in America.
That's true.
How can students, how can young people, how can old people, workers, so on and so, how can they prepare themselves for this increasingly globalized world?
I mean, I think one pretty easy thing to do is to travel. I mean, exposure is kind of key to get out there, because for a lot of people, the only reason why they focus on, the United States or America being all that there is because that's all they've been exposed to. If you haven't had an opportunity to travel to other places and to see other places and to interact with other people from around the world and not just the United States, you really don't know what's out there. Like sometimes I just look at like a globe or, a map of the world, and there's so many places that you can go. I mean, like the possibilities are literally endless. And, for me, that's one of the things. Also, I think something I had an opportunity to do in high school was to study abroad.
In high school? Yeah,
I did an exchange program for 3.5 weeks in France, and we, visited various places with my French class.
Wow.
And one of the reasons why I wanted to speak or to learn how to speak French was because so many African countries speak French, so that was important for me. But yeah, I had an opportunity to go over there to live with a family in a small town called Dole. And, they spoke French and very little English, so I was forced to really get my brain working. But it gave me an experience to really be immersed in another culture where I didn't speak the language as my first language, and you really start to learn and pay attention and, be exposed to more. So
yeah. I mean, that's definitely one option that's available. Well, that may not be available to everyone, actually. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's not necessarily the only option available to folks.
Not at all.
So today we're joined by our old friend, Dr. Keita, Dr. Maghan Keita, who is a professor at Villanova University. And we'll be jumping into this and much more when we come back on 28 Days and Beyond. Welcome back to 28 Days and Beyond. We're joined now by Dr. Keita. How you doing, Doc?
I'm fine. How about you all?
Good.
Doing
Yeah,
very
we're
well.
good.
Good.
So today we're talking about the importance of, being a sort of global citizen, being tapped into the world and things outside of the confines of this country. Is that important?
Yeah, it's very important, and it's important in more ways than we can imagine. So most people project it and think, yes, I need to be out in the world, but they forget that the moment in which we live is one in which seemingly our political leaders are retreating from the world. So it becomes more and more important that we figure out how we exercise our responsibilities as global citizens.
Well, what are some of the ways that we can do that given our leadership right now?
Well, one of the ways is to think about the space in which something like this happens. So within the confines of an educational institution, the first thing is learning. And learning that the very thing that we might call the United States is composed of more things than just simply the whole of this space that we call the United States. For people of color, and particularly people of African descent, It means the idea of coming to grips with diaspora, and diasporas in the plural. And so when we think about the notion of diasporas, African diasporas, immediately we have to embrace the global. And we have to figure out, we have to come to grips with the fact that those of us who reside in America, those of us who come under the general nomenclature of African Americans, are in fact a pretty heterogeneous and polyglot group. One of the things that has impressed me, maybe in the negative sense, about those people who narrowly define themselves as African Americans has been their reluctance, almost their fear to become global. A fear in some ways based on the history of the United States, a history that has always said that there's no place for Black people and no place outside of the United States where Black people could possibly feel comfortable. It's that kind of trope, those kinds of conventions, those kinds of stereotypes that affect Black folk in terms of Black Americans in particular, in terms of their notions of how they enter into, engage, and then embrace a kind of global space.
So why do you think that is, considering, obviously we have a history, right, several centuries deep at this point, of being told that this is not a place for us, right? So folks like, Martin Delany in the 1800s would travel around the world to find a place for Black people to settle. Why do you find it that Black people in this country, some Black people in this country, are reluctant to consider some other options?
Well, reluctant because the mechanisms of control, particularly as they're based on the production of knowledge in the conventional sense, have worked to really make African Americans feel that there is no place outside of the United States that they would be welcome. So you're not welcome at home and you're not welcome outside the United States. It is the notion that the kind of racism that we experience here must in fact be universal. Now, that's not to say that racism doesn't exist in other places, but it's to say that the racism has not prohibited other folk of African descent from moving around the world and finding their space.
So what do you think that we can do as a collective to kind of get past some of those ideas that are permeating in the back of our minds as it pertains to that?
One of the first things, again, educationally, is it's like Amari was pointing out, a bit of history. So if you can go back and chart Martin Delany, you might go back and ask how Phyllis Wheatley ends up in London. You might ask how various other people make their way back to places like Sierra Leone or Liberia. Or you might ask how all these people of African descent end up in Nova Scotia or in Chile or in Brazil. Or you might be watching some TV show, Netflix or what have you, and you might look in the background in a space that's supposedly Asian in, let's say, the 12th century and see faces that look like, and you'll say, well, what is that all about? I mean, is that just for network value, for driving up ratings, or is this something that I should explore?
Absolutely.
So it's the questions of exploration. It's the questions of understanding historically and therefore conceptually that Africans, people of African descent, have never been precluded from moving through the global space.
Well, we want to talk more about that, but we have to take a break. But we'll be back with more 28 Days and Beyond right after this.
We're back on 28 Days and Beyond with Dr. Keita. So we were talking a little bit about the sort of history going way back, but even the more recent history, we can ask why in every major American city do we see a significant population of people from the Caribbean or from the African continent? There's always been movement here, there, and everywhere, but it seems to me that, even working with students, for instance, that they're reluctant to go to, there are study abroad programs that they take advantage of. They would want to go to Europe. They would want to go to, places like Spain and France, but won't want to go to maybe the Caribbean or to the African continent. Why do you think that is?
Well, think about the space in which they reside. And again, we think about the ways in which they've been taught. Again, this is Toni Morrison being famous when she says, I read as I was taught. Well, we read these things as we were taught. So we read Africa and the Caribbean as we've been taught. And the essential element of some education, the kind of education I'm most fond of, is to teach you to reread, to read again, to read anew, to read with depth. So if you were reading the Caribbean or Africa, then you might read them in different ways. You might also be forced to read Europe or Asia in different ways, though. In ways that suggest, well, there might be a place for me there because there's a historical presence that has been neglected in the kinds of histories and cultural narratives that I've been given about these spaces. And in this notion that Morrison gives about learning to read again, we're not just simply reading text, literary text, right? We're reading everything as text, and we're understanding that there are some texts that we simply have been taught to gloss over and not see our own faces in them. And so that becomes an important moment. Probably one of the most pressing examples in Europe would be to ask questions about Spain.
Yeah.
All right, or to listen to the music of France, all right? Or to think about what happens in southern Italy, places like Sicily, or to go back and ask about moments in the construction of what would become classical Greece. All these things become important in terms of Africans, people of African descent, particularly African Americans, gaining their moorings and a sense of belonging in the world. Now that becomes even more important since we left the last presidential administration in the United States. Because one of the things that became important in that administration was the idea of having people of African descent who were in positions that had to be, in fact, be outward looking in terms of facing global issues on behalf of the United States. I don't think that that's going to change. In fact, historically speaking, in not the most immediate history, but in a history that's not far distant, people of African descent, African Americans, have been central to the policies of the U.S. government as they related to critical issues, from questions of Palestine to representations about, well, why we should go to war in Iraq. So these become critical moments that we need to think about. We need to figure out how we, in fact, embrace them and use them to the best that we can offer the world.
Dr. Keita, thank you so much for joining us today and for, offering your perspective, and really hopefully it'll open some eyes as it pertains to spreading our perspective and our view of the world, so to speak. But thank you.
Always happy to be with you guys.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back with more 28 Days and Beyond right after this. Welcome back to 28 Days and Beyond. Really enjoyed having Dr. Keita.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure.
So one of the things that he said, he said a lot, but one of the things that stood out to me was just kind of understanding the role of Black people all over the world and in the history therein. Interestingly enough, when I was traveling to Morocco, our layover was in Spain, and sometimes it takes just really understanding geography to understand how close things are. You know?
Yeah.
So we had this layover, and then next thing you know, we get on the plane and we're in Africa in no time.
Right.
So understanding that connection there and the proximity, and also understanding that while we might be the minority here in the United States, there are more people of color in the world than there are non-people of color.
Non-people of color. Yeah, exactly.
No, but just really understanding that and processing that, I think might help to kind of get us out of this mindset of, I don't know if being less than is appropriate.
Well,
but
that's why
perhaps
when you mention this term, this idea of minority, right? What is a minor? A minor is someone who has not reached full maturity, who does not have full, rights in society, and that's a tool, when we think of ourselves as confined by the borders of this country, then, you know, numerically we are smaller than everybody else. Right. But in terms of the global, we are the majority, you know, and I think, like, you know, even politically what that translates to is, so this was why Malcolm X would push for the idea of human rights. Civil rights, you're bound to the laws of that country, but human rights, you can expand it to the globe. And I think that that's part of the importance for Black people specifically, to understand, yo, man, if you go anywhere in the world where there are Black, you will find Black people.
You will find Black people.
And you will see people that you know. You know, like, I mean, you know, whether you go to Jamaica or Ghana or Trinidad or, you know, the Congo, you're going to see people who look like people you know in Philly, right? And then just through conversations, even though on the surface it may be like, oh, well, you know, we're so different. Through conversations, you realize the way that they laugh, the way that they talk, they interact with one another, the things that they find important and funny, that all of these things are commonalities, you know what I mean? And by placing yourself within that global context, it allows you to analyze your immediate surroundings much differently.
That's so true. And I've definitely been places where I had to do double takes, like, wait a minute.
That, right. Is that?
You look like,
exactly.
Are we family?
Yeah. Right. You don't want to run up on them asking, though, because it's...
No, I mean, I have actually.
Oh, word? It didn't work out?
No, it worked out fine. Yeah. Sometimes I make new friends.
That's it. That's the way to do it.
Because live life boldly. No, but seriously, I really want us to understand and to stop limiting ourselves. I think Definitely. It's really powerful what you said about even using the term minority. Terminology matters, right? Certainly. So just understanding that and getting away from these terms that make us feel diminished in any way or in any capacity, and broadening our horizon and just how we look at the rest of the world, I think is really important. And I hope that's what people take away from what we talked about today. Definitely. And even if, you know, travel is not an option that's immediately available to some folks, I mean, you know, there's the internet. Yes. You know, there are people in our communities who are from other places, just kind of getting to know what their experiences are, where they come from. Exactly. Right. Certainly so. And look some stuff up. And don't be afraid to ask people. Google. The Google. Exactly. This has been another episode of 28 Days and Beyond, where we talk about our history, our heritage, and our culture. We'll see you next time.